Good morning. This hearing will now come to order. On behalf of Ranking Member Banks and myself and the subcommittee, thank you all for being here. In searching this committee's history, we could not find any evidence that there has been a broad oversight hearing examining cybersecurity management challenges at the Department of Veterans Affairs. The Subcommittee on Technology Modernization is going to chart a new course today. Cybersecurity is not a new challenge in the federal government. Each year, the offices of Inspector General are mandated to audit compliance with the federal cybersecurity framework that has been established to protect information, programs, and assets from threats. Those threats have become more complex, and the potential for harm has only increased since the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, was passed in 2002. In the intervening years, we have also seen how big a target the healthcare sector has become for bad actors. Throughout the world, healthcare institutions have been breached and extorted, and data have been held hostage or stolen. Government healthcare institutions have not been immune from this either. Britain's National Health Service was a victim of one of the largest ransomware attacks in history. Almost daily, there are news reports or notifications by hospitals, insurance companies, and other entities that there has been a breach and that data may have been compromised. These attacks and breaches cost millions and impact the health care and benefits delivery. They also cause Americans to lose trust in institutions' ability to protect some of the most sensitive data there is. At the same time, the reliance on electronic personal data, the electronic sharing of that data, and the modernization of systems to support health benefits and public service delivery is growing. As this reliance on technology increases, so does the risk. Therefore, it only makes sense that one of our country's largest providers of health care and benefits should be at the forefront of addressing these risks. VA is in the process of modernizing numerous systems to adjudicate disability claims, provide educational benefits, and deliver health care. Information security management should be a key component of those efforts from the outset. However, my concern is that assessing risk and developing mitigation strategies does not have enough attention. Many OIG and GAO reports on security incidents cite management failures or lack of internal oversight as a reason behind the incidents. Too often, strong leadership on risk management and information security becomes an afterthought or a paperwork exercise done once a year for the FISMA audit. Even worse, it only becomes an issue after the system has been compromised and sensitive data is put at risk. Cybersecurity is a challenging and complex issue, and it requires an ever-changing response. The key is that the response needs to be a whole-of-government or a whole-of-agency effort. Every component of an agency needs to be involved, from the frontline staff employing good cyber hygiene to acquisition professionals assessing the risk in the supply chain, to IT professionals assessing the risks of new and legacy technology, and to leadership engaging in strategic assessments to understand the challenges and developing the plans to meet them. The purpose of today's hearing is to hear from VA leadership about cybersecurity landscape, the challenges, and the approach to risk management. We will hear from the Office of Inspector General about how the VA has fared in cyber risk management over the last several years and the outstanding concerns. We will also hear from the Government Accountability Office about responding to cybersecurity challenges and best practices for risk management. I would like this hearing to serve as a foundation for other cybersecurity-related oversight that the subcommittee will engage in over the next year. The better we understand the challenges and the risks, the better we are able to assess whether we are making progress and what more needs to be done. The protection of VA technology and data is not a hypothetical issue or something that occurs in a vacuum. These systems and data serve to support the care and the benefits our veterans have earned. I have heard from veterans loud and clear about privacy and data security concerns. And those concerns only become more amplified as more systems become electronic. We don't want to hold up progress that the VA is making on technology modernization, as we all know it is sorely needed, but we do need to be mindful of the risks that that we are taking as VA moves ahead. Further, as we encourage veterans to use VA resources, and most especially to find the support and care for the wounds, both visible and hidden, VA must show that it is secure, it can be trusted, and that it has the tools, policies, and the leadership to protect veterans' health data and personal information. This is all a part of a sacred obligation we have made to those who have served our country. I thank all the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, I'd now like to recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Banks, for 5 minutes to deliver any opening remarks he may have. Mr. Banks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. There was a time when cyber attacks primarily threatened national security agencies and financial institutions. That time is long past. Today, state-directed cyber attacks, cyber espionage, and cyber crimes are nearly daily occurrences, and they threaten every government agency and industry. Cybersecurity has been a consistent priority across administrations throughout successive Congresses, and I'm encouraged that cybersecurity policy is increasingly sound. However, implementation among federal agencies seems to be continually uneven and fragmented, and the federal government still often struggles to defend itself. Many of the technology modernization issues that we often discuss in other contexts also have major cybersecurity impacts. Legacy systems carry vulnerabilities, and scarce resources must be allocated to replacing them or hardening them. Competition for cybersecurity talent is fierce everywhere, but a one-size-fits-all personnel system hampers the federal government. The VA must approach cybersecurity risk management not only as a government agency, but also as a healthcare system. The healthcare sector recognized the cybersecurity imperative somewhat later than other industries. The first major cyber attack on a hospital system was not until 2014, when Chinese hackers stole 4.5 million patients' non-medical data from Community Health Systems, Incorporated. It became apparent that many healthcare organizations had not sufficiently recognized or prioritized cyber threats, and they began to play catch-up in their cybersecurity investments. Healthcare faces an inherent challenge. Modern patient-centered care and evidence-based medicine require the real-time exchange of huge volumes of sensitive personal data. Patients demand this, but they also expect peace of mind that their data will not be mishandled or stolen. The healthcare sector also contends with the increasing complexity and connectedness of medical devices. Medical devices were not always thought of as targets, but the FDA and manufacturers have recognized that their cyber vulnerabilities are similar to those of industrial control systems. Overall, VA's cybersecurity posture seems to be mixed. The Federal Information Security Modernization Act requires annual audits of each agency's cybersecurity practices. VA has been carrying a high number of unresolved recommendations for years, but this is slowly trending in the right direction. Some of the weaknesses are also documented in the OIG's annual financial audits, and they are unresolvable until VA replaces several outdated financial IT systems. I am encouraged that OIT has prioritized hiring cybersecurity talent, and I'm eager to see them demonstrate real progress in recruiting and retaining these personnel. I believe VHA and OIT have only begun to seriously tackle the issue of vulnerabilities in medical devices. Thousands of these devices are running in outdated operating systems, and some are so obsolete that it is not even possible to update the software. This issue cannot be allowed to fall into a bureaucratic impasse. On the other hand, VA has demonstrated real leadership in developing its technical reference model, which is a database of IT equipment and software that is approved for use. This is a good step toward ensuring that VA is buying technologies that are safe. Finally, I would like to address the issue of cybersecurity in the technology supply chain. Hackers can be virtually anyone, but when we talk about corrupting the supply chain, we are almost always talking about China. China is embedded in every aspect of the IT and communications equipment supply chain, and none of our other strategic adversaries come even close. China is the largest exporter of technology hardware globally, as well as a growing player in the mobile app marketplace. And nearly every U.S. hardware manufacturer's products contain multiple Chinese-made components. It is a frightening reality that some foreign companies are preloading malicious software into their products. HIMSS found in their 2019 cybersecurity survey that malware in commercial products accounted for 8% of significant cybersecurity incidents in healthcare systems. It has been the U.S. government's policy since the 90s to buy commercial off-the-shelf technology whenever possible, and this has been an overwhelming success in most respects. However, while federal agencies tend to view themselves as independent entities, our cyber adversaries, especially state actors, see them as one big interconnected target. Our adversaries coordinate all of their governmental, military, and corporate resources to hack our networks and compromise our supply chains, but we do nothing of the sort to defend ourselves. This has to change. We have to go far beyond a whole-of-government approach to cybersecurity. I thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to discussing these issues. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I will now introduce the witnesses we have before the subcommittee today. Mr. Paul Cunningham is Deputy Assistant Secretary and Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Cunningham is also a Navy veteran. Mr. Cunningham is accompanied by Mr. Gary Stevens, Deputy Chief Information Security Officer and Executive Director for Information Security Policy and Strategy. Mr. Andrew Centennial is Executive Director, Procurement and Logistics, Veterans Health Administration, and also an Army veteran. Thank you. And Ms. Luanda Jones, Deputy Chief Information Officer, Strategic Sourcing in the Office of Information and Technology. Mr. Nick Dahl, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audits and Evaluations, VA Office of Inspector General, who is accompanied by Mr. Michael Bowman, Director of Information Technology and Security Audits Division at the Office of Inspector General, and Mr. Gregory Wilshusen, Director of Information and Cybersecurity Team at the General Accountability Office. We will now hear the prepared statements from our panel members. Your written statements will, in full, will be included in the hearing record without objection. Mr. Cunningham, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair Lee, Ranking Member Banks, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the Department of Veterans Affairs cybersecurity strategy and its mission to protect the sensitive data of veterans and VA employees. I'm Paul Cunningham, VA's Chief Information Security Officer. I'm here with Mr. Gary Stevens, VA's Deputy CISO, Mr. Andrew Centennial with the Executive Director of Procurement and Logistics under VHA, and Ms. Luanda Jones, Deputy Chief Information Officer for Strategic Sourcing. I want to begin by thanking Congress and the subcommittee for your continued support and shared commitment to the success of VA's efforts in delivering secure and effective services to our nation's veterans. As a Navy veteran myself, I've seen firsthand the value and the real impact the VA has on the lives of so many of our veterans. As a chief security professional, I understand the value that technology brings and how VA's mission is supported. I'm also aware of the treasure trove of information that VA protects and the lengths our adversaries will go to gain access. Secretary Robert Wilkie is committed VA to leveraging new technologies and best approaches to streamline the department's services to our vets. However, new technologies and advancements bring additional risk to information systems, data management systems, and privacy. In accordance with Federal Information Security Modernization Act 2014, the Secretary has delegated the balancing of IT operations and cybersecurity to the Chief Information Officer, Assistant Secretary Jim Jaffer. Likewise, the CIO has designated me as the Chief Information Security Officer to administer the cybersecurity program on behalf of the VA. The Office of Information Security is charged to develop, implement, and maintain the VA cybersecurity program and the risk strategy. The cybersecurity program deploys a centralized risk strategy that proactively aligns efforts with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, meets federal requirements, and responds to today's threats while promoting VA's mission. OIS administers the program through a holistic and robust set of strategies and policies that leverage directives, assessments, and proactive monitoring. OIS defines policies and handbooks that outline the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders and defines the framework for implementation. Based on the OIS guidance, system owners are required to develop security plans that define the purpose of their systems, identify the security requirements, and catalogs the appropriate controls based on the security level of those systems. OIS uses those security plans in our ongoing assessments to ensure sites and systems meet established standards and are effective in safeguarding information. System owners and authorizing officials use assessment results and other security-related information in their determination if a system should have or should maintain access to VA's network and assessments. OIS oversees a dedicated cybersecurity operational center that monitors and responds to malicious network activities. This talented team serves as VA's cybersecurity incident response hub and coordinates with the Department of Homeland Security in accordance with federal requirements. Any gap or vulnerability identified by OIS through assessments and monitoring are managed through an active plan of action milestone or POA&M tracking system. The POA&Ms ensure remediation efforts are completed, assist in setting cybersecurity priorities, and provides additional analysis for policy and reporting. However, VA's cybersecurity program is more than one cybersecurity office. It relies on all elements of the organization to establish local procedures, to ensure policies, protocols, and agreements are followed properly. This includes limiting access to sensitive information, developing protocols for procuring third-party vendors, and using technical assets in a secure manner. As we say in the Navy, it's an all-hands effort. We do face challenges. New technologies, third-party partnerships, and advancement in operational technology introduce new security risks, not just at VA, but across the federal government and private industry. VA understands the need to address the growing challenges in security while improving access and services to veterans. We are working closely with our federal and our commercial partners to improve our ability to manage risk, maintain compliance with federal mandates. We are confident that our cybersecurity program is positioned to proactively support VA's mission. Madam Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you again for this opportunity, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cunningham. Mr. Dahl, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Banks, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Office of Inspector General's oversight of VA's Information Technology Security Program. My statement focuses on the security program's purpose and the challenges in protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of VA systems and data. IT systems and networks are critical to VA for carrying out its mission of providing medical care and a range of benefits and services to millions of veterans and their families. VA is responsible for storing, managing, and providing secure access to enormous amounts of sensitive data, including veterans' medical records, benefits determinations, financial disclosures, and education records. The OIG recognizes and appreciates that this is a complex undertaking. To the extent that VA does not properly manage and secure their IT investments, they can become increasingly vulnerable to misuse and mishaps. Lack of proper safeguards renders these systems and networks vulnerable to intrusions by groups seeking to obtain sensitive information, commit fraud, disrupt operations, or launch attacks against other VA systems. Security failures also undermine the trust veterans put in VA to protect their sensitive information, which can affect their engagement with programs and services. The Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002, known as FISMA, required that agencies develop, document, and implement an organization-wide security program for their systems and data. This act was amended in 2014 and became the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. Annually, the OIG reports on the extent to which VA has IT safeguards in place consistent with FISMA requirements. Our most recent FISMA audit revealed that VA has made progress developing and distributing policies and procedures as part of its security program. However, VA continues to face significant challenges in complying with FISMA requirements due, in part, to maintaining an aging and outdated IT security infrastructure. Our report contained multiple findings and 28 recommendations for improving VA's information security program. Most of these recommendations are repeated from previous FISMA audits, as VA has yet to adequately address them. Our findings and recommendations focused on the following areas: configuration management controls, which are designed to ensure critical systems have appropriate security controls and to ensure up-to-date vulnerability patches are implemented. In our vulnerability testing, we have found that critical security patches have not been consistently installed for various VA systems. Identity management and access controls, which are meant to make certain that password standards are consistently implemented and to ensure users' access privileges are limited to only legitimate purposes. The OIG has seen many examples of default usernames and passwords or the use of easily guessed passwords to provide increased opportunities for malicious users to gain unauthorized access to critical VA systems. The agency-wide security management program, which is intended to make sure that system security controls are effectively implemented and continuously monitored. This program is also designed to ensure that system security risks are effectively remediated through corrective action plans. VA has developed numerous plans of action and milestones to address identified system security risks. However, we continue to identify plans for which there is inadequate evidence of effective action to justify the closure of such plans. Overall, the OIG's FISMA audit, in addition to a range of other reports on VA's IT security program, show that VA has considerable work to do in order to achieve better IT security outcomes. VA's fundamental mission of providing benefits and services to veterans is dependent on deploying secure IT systems and networks. Until proven processes are in place to ensure adequate controls across the enterprise, VA's mission-critical systems and sensitive veterans data will remain at risk. While VA has made recent improvements in some aspects of information management, there continue to be considerable challenges. We believe that VA's successful implementation of open recommendations from oversight reports is an important step in its efforts to address cybersecurity and risk management concerns. Madam Chair, this concludes my statement. Mr. Bowman and I would be happy to answer any questions you or other members of the committee have.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. Mr. Wilshusen, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Lee, Ranking Member Banks, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. In providing health care and other benefits to veterans and their dependents, VA relies extensively on IT systems to receive, process, and store sensitive data, including veterans' medical records and other personally identifiable information. Accordingly, effective security controls are essential to ensure that VA systems and information are protected from loss, misuse, unauthorized disclosure or modification, and are available when needed. Today, as agreed, I will provide an overview of the status of information security across the federal government in general and at VA in particular. I will also discuss security challenges that VA faces as it modernizes and secures its systems. But before I do, if I may, I would like to recognize members of my team who were instrumental in developing my statement and the work underpinning it. With me today are Assistant Director Jeff Knott and Analyst in Charge Diamond Spencer. Also contributing were Chris Bazinski, Nancy Glover, Franklin Jackson, Daniel Swartz, Melina Asensio, Scott Pettis, and Zarak Poe. Thank you. Chair Lee, Ranking Members Banks, federal agencies, including VA, continue to have deficient information security programs. FISMA requires IGs to determine the effectiveness of their agency's security program. To do this, IGs used a 5-level maturity model to assess the implementation of 5 core security functions defined by the Nist cybersecurity framework. Of the 24 CFO Act agencies, VA was one of 18 agencies where the IG determined that the agency-wide information security program was not effectively implemented during fiscal year 2018. Additionally, most CFO Act agencies, including VA, had deficiencies in most general control categories for their financial systems in fiscal year 2018. For example, VA's IG reported weaknesses in security management, access control, configuration management, and contingency planning. Auditors at 12 agencies designated information security as a significant deficiency in internal control over financial reporting for their agency, while IGs at VA and 5 other agencies designated the deficiencies as a material weakness, the most severe kind. Fiscal year 2018 was the 17th year in a row that VA had reported a material weakness in information security. As VA secures and modernizes its information systems, it faces several key security challenges. These challenges pertain to implementing security controls over its information and information systems, mitigating known vulnerabilities in a timely and effective manner, establishing elements of a cybersecurity risk management program to identify, prioritize, and manage cyber risks, and categorizing the work roles of its IT and cyber-related workforce positions, a key step in identifying critical cybersecurity staffing needs. Like other federal agencies modernizing their IT systems, VA faces an additional challenge of managing IT supply chain risks. If unchecked and exploited, these risks could hamper VA's ability to serve our veterans. In summary, similar to other federal agencies, VA continues to be challenged in implementing an effective agency-wide program and controls for securing its information and information systems. As VA pursues efforts to modernize and secure its IT systems, it will need to successfully address multiple challenges in order to achieve effective outcomes. Chair Lee, Ranking Members Banks, this concludes my written statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, and I'd like to start with you, Mr. Cunningham. You have a rich history and career in the federal information security space, including with the Department of Energy. When you arrived at the VA in January 2019, what, if any, observations did you make about where the VA stands with regards to its progress in adopting good practices and prioritizing cybersecurity?
Thank you, and thank you for the comments earlier about understanding the challenges that VA has in this area, as well as across the federal government. It's true, risk and risk management and cybersecurity is a challenge in a lot of federal agencies and how they approach it. Obviously, we use Nist as our reference guide manuals, the risk publications under 839 and 37 describe how to implement a cybersecurity program. And what I've noticed when I arrived at VA was that we had an incredibly talented pool of people, especially when it regards to how we monitor the network traffic and our ability to respond. I also saw a very strong relationship with DHS, which was a very positive thing, and where we could partner. I did notice that there was some siloing, or what I looked to see like remains of silos that may have been in the past. But I quickly realized that working with operations, there was a open door, which a lot of times in federal agencies, there might be some conflicts between operations and cybersecurity, but that was not in place at VA, which was very reassuring. And also VA's approach to centralized cybersecurity, which is a little bit different than I've seen in other agencies, but promoted by Nist as well, was a welcome change. So there's still some legacy issues that I've noted, especially around the FSMA reports in FY18 or some of the findings from IG. But I also saw some really clever ideas that were being put in place to promote greater awareness through senior leadership. For instance, they developed a quality Office of Quality, Process, and Risk. And they've established a risk officer, which was an incredible feat because a lot of organizations have difficulty getting the office set up and being staffed. So that was remarkable, and it's a great ally for cybersecurity as a whole to be able to have somebody that is equal pairing and unbiased feeding to the CIO and the Secretary information regarding cybersecurity risk. I also saw we also started looking at realignment to kind of the core values that we really look at, especially around FSMA 2014. We started looking at Nist, the pure Nist regulations and where those pockets and pools of money and activities are being placed. And then we also have a governance structure that is not siloed for cybersecurity, but actually I have an opportunity every week to talk with my peers, both in operations and HR and strategic sourcing, that talk about what issues I have, as well as listen to what issues they have where we can be a better service to veterans. Probably the most important part I noticed was the commitment from the CIO, as well as the Secretary and Deputy Secretary. They understand cybersecurity, and they're a great ally.
Thank you. It sounds like you're making some progress, especially within the management level at the VA. Are there any program office changes that you're planning to make to ensure proper level management for cybersecurity?
At this time, I think we have a 3-level structure in the Office of Information Security. That gives us the ability to, one, be proactive in building strategy and policy, at the same time running operations and incident response. If any changes in there, they're pretty much cosmetic because the activities will pretty much remain the same, maybe sequential amounts, so we have better management and visibility of it. With that, I don't see any other changes that I need at this time, but certainly how we integrate with operations is effective. And so with that, I think we're good.
Great, thank you. I am now yielding to Ranking Member Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Welshusen, federal cybersecurity policy seems to be increasingly well developed, but its implementation seems to be as disjointed as ever. We are here today to talk about VA, but how should VA fit into a whole of government approach to cybersecurity?
Well, I'd certainly agree with you that policies and procedures that are being developed for federal agencies are getting better, becoming more comprehensive. And you're absolutely correct in that the implementation and execution of those policies and procedures has been inconsistent across federal agencies. And I think that is something that will continue to occur. We will certainly keep looking at that as we conduct our government-wide work. But I think VA, certainly in its role as protecting the systems at that department, has some areas for improvement. As the IG has consistently reported over the last several years, there are a number of particular areas where that department needs improvement, to include in its access controls, which are intended to help detect and limit access to agency systems, as well as assuring the proper management and configurations of its systems and the like. But indeed, VA certainly has a key role in improving the security over its systems and the networks that it operates and uses.
All right, Mr. Cunningham, How does VA fit into a whole of government approach to cybersecurity?
So I think we've done a lot in the last 10 months I've been there. We've been working closely with the the CISO Council, the Federal CISO Council under OMB. We also look for partnering opportunities. For instance, we work with Department of Energy. We have several activities that are out through one of their national labs, and in there we're partnering with their cybersecurity team to ensure that it's not just a drop and go, but a partnership. And then we're also working with our internal and external partners around medical devices and how we can be a better partner in establishing regulations and requirements.
Okay. How do we know, how much do we know about the threat actors targeting the VA? How many of them are nation-state actors as opposed to cyber criminals? And how many of them are foreign versus domestic?
So while the department does not have a dedicated intelligence community element like some agencies do, and however, we do have classified access to information, and we share that information with, or we get shared information from DHS as well as the intelligence community through high-side communications. We do have active state-sponsored threat actors that are trying to get in. We recognize those where we can. But a lot of times when we see an attack or we see some sort of attempt, we don't spend a lot of time doing attribution as much as blocking, because we leave that to DHS and the intelligence community.
All right. DoD has what is called the Unified Capabilities Approved Product List. And VA has its Technical Reference Model. They both contain lists of IT and communications equipment that is approved for purchase and believed to be free of malware and backdoors. How is the TRM developed?
So the TRM, I don't have the exact process. I believe it's worked through a group, but I will actually pass that to Ms. Jones.
Thank you, sir. The TRM, we have a dedicated team in OINT who assess the products that are being placed on the in the TRM. We'll be more than happy to, at a later date, come back and bring the appropriate people to do a deep dive into the products that's on that list, how we assess the products.
Okay, that would be great. The DoD OIG has discovered instances of items on the approved product list containing vulnerabilities. What is your level of confidence that the TRM does not contain compromised items?
So again, sir, we'll bring the appropriate folks to answer that question because I just don't want to just say something off the cuff. We'll bring you that.
Maybe not confident enough. I have many more questions, but my time has expired.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Roy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Apologize for being a few minutes late. We're down on the floor of the House of Representatives. As you know, we have to multitask around here some, but appreciate y'all being here. Appreciate y'all taking the time to address these important topics. Mr. Cunningham, a question for you, if you don't mind. I'm sure you're aware of the emerging Internet of Things, which is the interconnection of devices, machines, and objects equipped with network connectivity. The research firm Gartner predicts that by next year, the Internet of Things technology will be in 90%, as you know, I suspect, of new computer-enabled product designs. And it poses a significant cybersecurity challenge for VA as it procures and attempts to secure these devices. So question for you is, do you believe that the VA is prepared for this new security challenge, and how do you intend to mitigate the new risks that the Internet of Things introduces?
So it's a greater challenge. Internet of Things, we can call them SCADA, we can call them, I call them operational technology, whether it's under medical or power, other sources. How they work and how they communicate with the cloud is very challenging from a from a cybersecurity perspective. But one of the things we do here at the department is make sure that anything plugged in is protected. We also do that with our wireless communications. So before anything can connect to our internal network, our business networks, those have to go through a vetting process through procurement. They're also then identified and then manually loaded into our network to be able to communicate. So things that someone might bring in around a Fitbit watch or other IoT purchased item, consumer purchased items, will not be able to get into the dedicated networks. We do have guest networks that are monitored, but they're also architectured off so they don't have access. They actually have to go out and come back in as if they were from home, so that they're not a bigger threat.
Well, in that same vein, VA is attempting a multitude of systems modernizations. You know, we know that across various platforms, while contending with a lot of the bureaucratic constraints that go along with that. The technology industry is obviously moving at breakneck speed. You know, I've got an iPhone in my pocket that 10 years ago was, you know, pretty much brand new. How are you all keeping your cybersecurity posture current in light of that and you know, the issue you were just addressing before? Is there, what, do you guys have like a sort of task force that focuses on this stuff and how to stay ahead of the curve? Do you work with private sector to do that? How are you keeping up?
We don't have a dedicated task force, but we do have, we've hired a lot of people from the outside that are very technically smart in this area, especially when it comes to getting access via smartphone to bring better services to veterans. So part of that is we've recently adopted the DevSecOps model, which is very similar to what's out in industry, and that allows us to be more agile in development, where we can actually bring capabilities, part capabilities, early to the customer, and then continue refining to get the end result that we wanted. This actually is very useful not only from an operational perspective, but from a cybersecurity perspective as well. You know, we're able to embed ourselves in this development process as a requirement early and at the right phase. So as each new capability is being added, we can redefine and reevaluate the security postures that we have in place. So each deliverable, we're not waiting until the very end to try to bolt cybersecurity on. That's kind of the terms that we've talked about in the past, where we do a lot of development. At the end, we try to secure it. Costs a lot of money doing it that way. So we try to bake it in or embed it in through the system lifecycle of the product itself.
Well, thank you for that. One quick question for you, Mr. Dahl, my limited time that I've got remaining. Earlier in your testimony, you mentioned that 2 VBA cybersecurity incidents, veteran-sensitive personal information was improperly placed in a shared drive at the Milwaukee Benefits Office, and the security risk level for the beneficiary fiduciary field system was set too low. How would the cybersecurity initiatives VA has recently implemented, such as continuous monitoring in the Operations Center, have prevented these incidents?
Well, this is a big challenge for VA. It's a large organization, as you know, and it's so decentralized. So when you run into an incident like that in Milwaukee, where it's really people putting information on a shared drive that they shouldn't have, it's a challenge for Mr. Cunningham sitting in D.C. to prevent that. But they have an action plan. They've made that read-only, those shared network drives. So that's a step in the right direction. The BFFS setting that at a moderate rather than a high level, I think they're in the process of reconsidering what the appropriate level is. I would hope that when they are implementing these new systems going forward, that they take a harder look at the type of data that is going to be available in those systems and the people that are able to access that data, and err on the side of caution. You know, I know there's a concern about functionality, and setting levels might impact functionality, but it really is important in this day and age, as you all know, to protect that sensitive data.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. I yield back the minute that I've gone over.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Watkins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to the panel for being here. Mr. Wilshusen, in your testimony, you describe how the VA categorizes its information security incidents in terms of entry points and method of attack. 41 are listed as other. Was this information not reported, or is it unknown?
It was reported to the U.S. CERT as other, which could mean that's unknown. And compared to other federal agencies government-wide, that category is typically around 27% of all incidents reported to U.S. CERT by other federal agencies are reported as other. And what that can indicate, particularly since this is a relatively large percentage of the incidents, is that the VA's or the department's capability to detect or to categorize and investigate these incidents is limited. And that's important to have a really good understanding of what type of incident occurred, how it occurred, and being able to report that up to DHS and US CERT, because that information is then used to look at incidents across the federal government and then being able to help look for opportunities to share information with other agencies to address similar type of incidents. So not having that information is certainly detrimental.
Thanks. Mr. Cunningham, do you have anything to add about the other security incidents?
Categorization is difficult. I appreciate the comments made about the high percentage and the importance of sharing that information with our partners. Certainly, the CISOs, the Federal CISO Council was looking for ways to refine and put more fidelity in reporting, and we're on board with talking with DHS about that in the future to help refine our ability to categorize those and still meet the reporting requirements.
Okay. Also, your testimony discusses VA's enterprise cybersecurity and privacy strategy, which was updated this year to incorporate government and industry best practices. The government best practices seem to come primarily from the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. What are the industry best practices, and where do they come from?
As a larger federal government, there's a committee that has a privacy committee where they talk about best practices, and we're able to share. Inside VA, some of the best practices that we're deploying is one, we moved privacy under the Office of Information Security. This means that we're more aligned, and I'm actually the chief privacy officer as well. This puts me in a unique position to be able to support privacy, both from a cybersecurity perspective as well as an information protection perspective. So I'm intimately familiar with the challenges of privacy. I brief with the privacy team at least once a week about the challenges that we have and ways that we can either A, remediate, educate, or at least elevate the issues that we have in that arena.
Executive Order 13800, strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure, which was issued last year, is a significant step forward in federal cybersecurity. You describe VA's implementation of the executive order as moving from reactive to proactive cyber risk management. Can you give me some concrete examples of how you're doing things differently now?
So the risk management framework focuses strongly on systems, and if you look at the next level up around missions, you can see where the cybersecurity framework outlined in 13800 is a great value. It gives us the structure to be able to communicate with our operations team around the value of proactively identifying issues instead of responding reactively and then having to remediate. I can tell you that we've done some work in setting up our priority queue and stack, and the CFM is part of that alignment. So now when we have our budget plans, it ties into, it takes 13800, FISMA, and IG recommendations as a priority queue and weights them. So we know we're spending our money with the biggest bang for the buck to improve our cybersecurity posture.
Ms. Jones, has the VA ever suspended or debarred a company for violating cybersecurity rules?
Sir, the VA uses various contract clauses to ensure that in our requirements documents that we are not getting vendors that has been debarred or suspended.
So do you believe the Buy American Act and the Trade Agreements Act, as they are implemented in government contracting, are effective in protecting the supply chain?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Ms. Jones or Mr. Centennial, does the VA, this is following up on Ranking Member Banks' question, does the VA have restrictions on the purchase of certain types of or manufacturers of off-the-shelf equipment?
Ma'am, this goes into the clauses that we use, which basically there are two basic types. One clause is to basically state that we are prohibited from any unauthorized manufacturers or any unauthorized products and services that the government has basically stated that we will not use in the federal government. And we also refer in our contract requirements documents to our 6500, our various cybersecurity policies and procedures.
So is there a specific list for the VA, yes or no? Or is this just the federal, like the general federal government list?
The question is not a yes or no, because it's based upon the clauses. So we can bring the acquisition personnel to provide a deep dive. To the best of my knowledge, there is, in the federal government, there is a list or a process that the contracting officers have to use, and these clauses that we put in our contracts basically say that you cannot, if there are prohibited manufacturers or prohibited processes or products, you cannot bring them into the, we cannot purchase them.
So there's not a specific VA list, you're using the federal government list?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
And did you
Mr.
wanna-
Centennial, what role does the VHA play in supply chain management?
Madam Chair, excuse me, Madam Chair, the VHA, from a procurement and logistics standpoint, plays into the biomedical maintenance community for medical devices. The Office of Healthcare Technology Management in VHA does a whole of agency, as was referenced earlier, approach to integrating medical devices with the Office of Information Technology, the local information security officers. It is also tied in with the procurement offices, a complete composite enterprise risk analysis for medical devices. So from a procurement standpoint, they have to be completely vetted through that process in order to ensure that as we go out to do procurements, they have all been validated that they have meet the cybersecurity requirements.
Okay. You know, now that it seems that we're moving into the world of applications, and we had a privacy roundtable a couple weeks ago, and there seemed to be some conflicting information about the security of them. So I just wanted to ask, once an app is allowed to connect or download or access veterans' health data, can that data can be sold under expansive terms of use under these apps, used without permission or stolen by bad actors. And the Washington Post recently reported that soldiers in an intelligence unit were told to download an app developed for the unit that could provide weather updates, training changes, and other logistics. However, that app could collect a trove of sensitive personal data, including photos, calendar, location, even email, other contacts. Mr. Cunningham or Mr. Stevens, since the VA is promoting partnerships with app providers, including health apps, what steps is the VA taking to educate veterans on protecting their personal data?
So I think you captured the challenge of that fairly well. Once it leaves VA's space, and how the veteran uses that information becomes a challenge, and education is our primary key. So we've recognized this problem. We're looking with our training department on how we can do it through flyers, certainly promoting videos. Currently, we have a video around National Cybersecurity Awareness Month that we play in our waiting rooms. Any chance we can give information to the veteran about protecting their own data as part of that is important.
Are you taking any steps to vet these apps that you promote?
Now, the ones we do promote are vetted through our development teams. They have to go through analysis based off what they're going to do with that information. They have to sign a release saying that they're not going to sell that information. And we're also looking at what type of information that they can download. I'll ask Mr. Stevens, do you have anything to add?
I would also add that for those particular apps that are accessing the VA data, they have to comply with a set of design patterns that have been specified that articulate specifically what they can and cannot do. So an app is only is restricted within that boundary to only do those things, and that's part of the rigorous review that would be conducted through that team.
So if it's found that an app is improperly using data, what's the repercussion after your review, after?
If it's found that veteran data has been compromised in any instance, then there is a defined process per policy that clearly articulates how to handle that incident based upon the magnitude of the event to really distill, is it an event, yes or no, and then go through an iterative process. And then depending upon the outcome, we'll judge how we respond accordingly through either, providing the veteran with particular services that they would need for credit monitoring or the like.
Are there any repercussions on the app developer?
I'd have to check on that.
Okay, I'd like to have some information. That's a major issue with veterans in terms of their trust on how their data is used. I'm running out of my time. I will now recognize Ranking Member Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Wilshusen, I want to contrast hacking government networks with compromising the supply chain. The pervasiveness of Chinese companies in the technology supply chain is well established. That includes state-controlled firms as well as those that pretend to be otherwise. It would never be feasible for the U.S. government to turn away from commercial technology, so that is not a solution. But we need a more effective defense. The answer could be to centralize responsibility for cybersecurity up and down the federal supply chain, and maybe even centralize the supply chain itself. You audit cybersecurity throughout the federal government. How do we solve the supply chain vulnerability problem?
Well, I think because with IT supply chain, it's important to remember that this occurs and the risk occurred throughout the entire life cycle of the assets that we use. And so I think first and foremost, it's important for agencies to first make sure that they have robust and effective foundational practices for securing and acquiring their IT assets. And that includes making sure that the agencies appropriately identify those risks, determine what the threats and vulnerabilities are within their supply chains, and that includes even after we have a system up and running at our organization and we're relying on other external service partners to provide these capabilities for us. And so it's important to make sure that our fundamental things in terms of assessing risk, selecting the controls that are appropriate to meet those risks, assuring doing due diligence over our suppliers and our service providers, and also then making sure we have appropriate monitoring capabilities in place to assure that the appropriate controls are being implemented. And also importantly, it's required that we integrate the security requirements into our contractual vehicles and into the acquisition process. And so it can't be two separate aspects where we have one group acquiring IT assets and another group that's responsible for securing. They need to be joined so they have the ability to assure that security is being built and is being implemented and considered when acquiring our IT assets. The other key thing, I believe, is also assuring that we have a robust software and hardware testing program. So as we do identify and receive software, that we test the code to make sure that there aren't backdoors hidden into the software code, and making sure that it's performing the functions for which is intended, and we intend for that software to occur.
Okay. Mr. Dahl, what is your perspective on that?
I will let Mr. Bowman take that question.
I definitely agree that there needs to be a very thorough vetting process when you're bringing on new applications and new hardware. Before connecting anything to the network, there needs to be a robust testing process just to make sure that the controls are in place, and you need to have an effective continuous monitoring process to make sure that your security posture doesn't change over time. So, with any security program, it's a cyclical process, but you have to continuously evaluate your risks, and you have to mitigate those risks and continually evaluate the controls just to make sure your posture remains intact.
Mr. Cunningham, anything you'd like to add?
So when it comes to supply chain risk management, Nist talks about it being our high-impact systems, although in national security systems, it's for low, moderate, and high-impact systems. So that's one challenge that we have to be able to understand, that when we apply it, we have to also look downstream from moderate and lows, and where do we kind of make that risk-based approach, because it's very costly, and even NIST publication 800-161 talks about that challenge. But specifically what we're doing at the department, I'll pass to Mr. Gary Stevens about our process there.
So, sir, whenever hardware or software gets added to the environment, it goes through a rigorous process consistent with the risk management framework, which is an assessment of those controls at varying degrees of veracity. And that includes both scanning, using Nessus tools and those types of things to understand those hardware vulnerabilities. And then also, if code, for example, gets developed internally, we have internal software assessment processes that we follow, that we allow the developer to access and use that assessment tool to iteratively assess their code as it's in the process of being developed, so they can make corrective actions on an as-required basis. The end result of that, either internally developed code or externally provided hardware software, is a risk perspective on that particular environment that gets rolled up in a comprehensive way for an authorizing official to sign off on that level of risk in whatever level they can, and then accept that risk.
Thank you. My time has expired.
I now recognize Mr. Roy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Picking up a little bit on this conversation that you're having on the supply chain issues, Mr. Centineo, if I might come to you for a minute, and then Ms. Jones, I'll go to you, and maybe we can kind of go back and forth on this. But how do you work together to coordinate cybersecurity in the VHA supply chain? If you guys could talk about that a little bit. Which you're responsible for, and then the IT supply chain, which, Ms. Jones, you're responsible for, if I understand it correctly. And can you give some specific examples and how that you guys interact, and how that works?
So, sir, the procurement aspects are IT is on through the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction, which is the Technology Acquisition Center at the department level. I have the responsibility at the Procurement and Logistics VHA side, particularly for medical devices. As was kind of brief a few minutes ago, there's a very iterative process within the agency that the Healthcare Technology and Management Office within VHA has a prescriptive process for cybersecurity to be able to identify the types of devices that need to be used. Then it works its way into the Office of Information and Technology, the local level information security officers, and it is all managed to make sure that every device that is procured or is a requirement to be procured has a completed enterprise risk assessment or risk analysis done before we actually receive it in the procurement side of the house. We actually just act upon their output to be able to go out and procure the items. The process is managed up through the Specialized Device Security Division of OIT, so it is collaborative to ensure that we have matched and worked within the OIT parameters of what the security requirements are. That's for the biomedical devices, but the IT side of the house, Ms. Jones has for the strategic sourcing.
Yeah, anything you want to add, Ms. Jones? to that?
Yes, sir. So from an IT perspective, the CIO is responsible for implementing the federal IT Information Technology Reform Act, FTARA. And so one of the things that we have put in place is department-wide a FTARA process that regardless of what you're purchasing, you have to go through the appropriate procedures from a FTARA compliance perspective. But in addition to that, my office works hand in hand with our Office of Acquisition and Logistics and Construction Office, who's really the contracting arm of VA, to ensure that we have the right contract clauses to make sure that we are not purchasing anything that is prohibited, and also that we have the right cybersecurity, once again, clauses in our contracts. So I see our office in OINT as working hand in hand with the entire VA, whether it's VHA, VBA, NCA, the whole department from an IT FTARA compliance.
A question for both of you again, whatever order you want to take it up. How do you all, how is cybersecurity in the supply chain handled differently between software and services and hardware? Can you just touch on that a little bit?
If I may, sir, I think that's a more appropriate question for Mr. Stevens to answer.
Okay.
Well, again, I would say that for cybersecurity, as it relates to purchasing hardware, software, either procured through a vendor or internally developed, regardless of how that procurement chain happens, it still has to go through the same process, and that's the process I described earlier, which is a rigorous review of the hardware and software environment, the technical controls associated with each aspect of those particular systems, and then that rolls up into the larger authorization boundary, and that boundary ultimately has a risk perspective rendered consistent with whatever the status is of those particular controls in compliance with the particular Nist requirements. And that perspective gets signed off and the risk identified by the particular action officer, or excuse me, authorizing official.
Thank you all. Yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Mr. Wilshusen. In the GAO testimony at a previous hearing, it referenced a report that found that the VA had regressed in terms of leadership commitment. And based on today's testimony, it seems that the VA still failed to take action on 42 of the 74 action items that the GAO identified in 2016. In the 6 months since that report was issued, has the VA corrected its course?
We're still waiting, and indeed, actually, we just this week received documentation from VA on a number of those open recommendations from 2016, and we are in the process of reviewing them. So I'll know better after we have a chance to analyze the evidence that was provided to us this week.
Okay, and we'd love to have an update on that.
I'll be happy to give that.
What is the status of the VA to address the recommendations that the GAO made over the last 4 years?
Well, one of the stats is, as I mentioned, we just received the evidence related to many of those, but as you mentioned, 42 of the 74 recommendations we made back in 2016 are still open and been not implemented in our view. One of the issues that we've identified in reviewing evidence that VA has provided to us over the years is that often it doesn't seem like it is validating the effectiveness of its corrective actions, because it has asserted, for example, that it had implemented 39 of the 42 recommendations that currently are open, but when we went in and looked at the evidence provided, It wasn't sufficient enough for us to confirm the implementation of that recommendation so we could close it. And so that's one of the challenges I think it faces, is just validating and verifying the effectiveness of its corrective actions. And so that's one aspect. We've also made 4 recommendations to VA relative to a cybersecurity risk management program, which we issued a report earlier this year on. That is a government-wide review. VA concurred with each of those 4 recommendations and asserted that it is taking actions to implement them, as it is in the recommendation we made relative to its categorization of its the work roles of its IT and cybersecurity workforce positions. We noted that VA had correctly categorized, I think it was like around 45% of its IT positions. We made a recommendation for them to review that categorization in terms of what work roles those positions perform. It concurred with our recommendation and also asserted that it is taking corrective action. We have not yet received evidence of the completion of those actions as of today.
With respect to the validation of progress, are there any institutional changes that you recommend for VA leadership to help facilitate better results in that respect?
Well, one is just to make sure that as the folks who are implementing the corrective actions, is that it is probably reviewed and that those actions are confirmed perhaps by an independent party or another person or another group within the organization. We had noted that at other agencies, Office of Personnel Management, as an example, had taken a similar approach where an independent party within the office had reviewed the actions taken by the operational folks and implementing our recommendations and resolving the underlying vulnerability. So just having a secondary check to verify the effectiveness of those controls would be useful. And I might also add, in many of our recommendations, they're limited to the scope of our review, but many of the vulnerabilities that we identify could apply to other similar systems. Typically, we only look at a few systems when we go in and examine information security controls, maybe 10, 15. But whatever vulnerabilities we identify on those systems could very likely also be in effect and affect other systems. And so organizations would be wise to see if similar systems are also afflicted by the vulnerabilities that we identified during our examinations.
Okay, thank you. I now recognize Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cunningham, there is no doubt in my mind that when a company infects its products with malware or inserts backdoors or engages in any kind of hacking, it must be immediately banned from doing business with the U.S. government. I'm going to ask you a series of questions about companies that have been proven to have done just that. I want you to tell me whether VA has ever purchased their products either before or after bans were put in place. So, Mr. Cunningham, has VA ever purchased equipment from Huawei Technologies?
I'm going to have to take that back for the record.
Okay. Mr. Cunningham, has VA ever purchased from ZTE Corporation?
I'll have to take that back for the record.
How about Hytera Communications Corporation?
I'll have to take that back for the record.
Same question. Has VA ever purchased from Hangzhou Hikvision Digital Technology Company?
I'll have to take that back for the record.
How about Dahua Technology Company?
I'll have to take that back for the record.
The last one, has VA ever purchased software from Kaspersky Lab?
I'll take that back for the record as well.
All right. We'll look forward to those questions being answered for the record. Mr. Cunningham, as I said in my opening statement, it seems cybersecurity became a focus in the healthcare sector relatively late. The CHS hack should have been a wake-up call, but cyber criminals may still see healthcare organizations as soft targets. VA is in somewhat of a unique position as a government agency and a healthcare system. How do you evaluate your cybersecurity risk and shape your strategy accordingly?
You're correct in assessing VA as also a healthcare provider. We're the largest networked healthcare provider in the United States, and we take that role seriously, and we work with our partners on that. I can say that we share information with our partners, and we share it with DHS, so to the greater good, let our detection be their protection, and likewise. So in the question, I would say that we have that same struggle that all have when it comes to hospitals, very well-intentioned, very smart employees wanting the best service they can for their customers, and in our case, our veterans. We'll sometimes we'll look for opportunities to streamline the process to bring in new technology where we can and how we can through technical means and policies we put in place. We minimize that, and when we recognize it, we take appropriate action, whether it's through education of the individual, or if we see it malicious or known policy break, through administrative means.
Okay. Madam Chair, that's all the questions I have, but I do ask for unanimous consent to enter the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission's report entitled Supply Chain Vulnerabilities from China in U.S. Federal Information and Communications Technology into the record.
Without objection, thank you. I now recognize Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. For our GAO witnesses, would you mind elaborating a little bit on how VA compares to other federal agencies? I saw in the report that they're one of 18, I think, of the 24 who have cybersecurity as a material weakness. Are you able to say anything about among those 18, sort of where VA sits?
Yeah, I would probably say, based on a couple of factors, where they are with their information security program is consistent in many ways with many federal agencies, but I also think in a couple of areas it's maybe a bit beneath the others, particularly when it comes to looking at the length of time that it has consistently reported a material weakness in the security controls over its financial systems for financial reporting purposes. It's been going on 17 years in a row now. Few agencies, I believe, meet that longevity of that particular weakness. In addition, the number of and percentage of its cybersecurity and IT-related personnel and the work roles that they perform, the high percentage of positions that were miscategorized based upon the work roles from the NICE Cybersecurity Workforce Framework was rather startling in many respects. So in a couple areas, I think it could do a much better job. But like most federal agencies, particularly the larger ones, they have a number of significant challenges to overcome.
Thanks. Mr. Cunningham, I wanted to continue Mr. Banks' line about the supply chain issues a little bit, and if there's someone else who's better to answer it, you can let us know. But my questions are a little less specific. It just seems like the concern about the supply chain is coming at a good time in some ways for VA, because I've only been sitting on this committee a little over a year, and I've heard a lot about how we need to do infrastructure upgrades, we need to buy new computers, new systems, routers, networks, all this kind of stuff, especially looking down the road toward the records modernization that we're going to have, and how that's going to really rely on having the bones of a modern system that can run it. So what is VA doing right now proactively, regardless of what has happened in the past? What are you doing proactively to ensure a safe supply chain for everything that's going to be purchased, say, for the next 4 or 5 years?
So I would put in that VA is compliant with DHS's recommendations around binding operational directives when it identifies at-risk vendors or solutions. And we also support GSA and their efforts to identify where the best sources to buy from that have been vetted. So in that regards, I would say that we're struggling, like many other federal agencies, to understand where our department resides in either blacklisting a particular organization or company, and not. That's not exactly in the VA's mission to determine whether a company is allowed to do work with the federal government or not. We'll leave that to general counsel and certainly to DHS and the intelligence community to tell us where we should not go and where we should not operate.
Okay, so is it, in other words, is it safe to say you're sort of following the advice that's being issued across the federal government? You're not getting like specific, you're not getting input from these agencies that are specific to VA or to healthcare type data and systems?
So, correct. We're following the federal regulation. And in that, if we feel that there's a vendor we prefer not to use because of past experience, then it's certainly inside the roles of the procurement team as well as the authorizing official and the system owner to not acquire that equipment.
Okay, and last, I saw in the news, I think within the last week, that veterans' health data is going to be available through Apple Health on iPhones now. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Are there security implications of that? Does Apple sort of assume the role of the protector of that data at that point, or how have you thought through that?
So we're looking at ways to protect that information so it's ensured that it's tunneled all the way from the time it leaves VA's accredited boundary to it arrives into the veteran's personal device. There's agreements with Apple on acceptable use of that data and protecting of that data.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you. I was concerned when I looked at the VA's budgetary submission for 2020. The 2019 budget contained $381 million for information security, while the 2020 budget is $362. Mr. Cunningham, could you tell me why there's a $19 million reduction?
Well, one, I think there's opportunities where we've seen already where we can consolidate some of our activities to be more effective. Definitely where we can partner or even ask for support from our other VA partners as regards to, especially if it's a specialized cybersecurity service that we're providing to a particular pillar inside a department. So we're looking at ways to be more effective identifying where the money is going, what activities are being tied to in that regard.
Great. We like saving money. One question I have, why is security not listed as one of OIT's 3 strategic goals in this budgetary proposal?
I'd have to ask the team that put that together, who's not here today.
Okay.
I'll take that back for the record.
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham or Stevens, this is in respect to the breaches in Milwaukee and Long Beach and the BFS. Something that concerned me was that VA's internal assessments determined that these weren't technically breaches and therefore did not require that veterans be notified of the incidents. Is the VA considering updating what it defines as a breach so that veterans affected by these incidents can and will be notified?
So from a privacy perspective, we had no evidence that the information was taken outside of VA's bounds or that personnel that were not read in or accountable through user agreements to protect that data had access. So in that regards, we look at it that while we can notify individuals, that would be, looking at it, do you show, if we show that it hasn't left the building, do we show that that has been compromised? And so by definition, we look at it that it has not. So where the benefit of notifying an individual that their information was looked upon by somebody who had authorization or signed agreements to protect the data, we didn't see as being reportable.
This is for the GAO. is the VA's definition of breach that we just heard here, is that in accordance or is it consistent with the rest of the federal government?
Usually a breach is referred to as one where it's a violation of policy or practice that it could put information and services at risk.
Okay. So the policy that you have, do you think that that is in line with what veterans are expecting with respect to the security and the privacy of their data?
I think as it's presented, that it hasn't left the VA, it hasn't been in possession by those that are bound to maintain the security of that information. I believe as a veteran, I would understand that there are protocols that are broke, and things do happen, but it's provided that the information was not leaked or lost, then I would understand that that's part of operations, and I hope they would do better in the future to make sure that doesn't happen or occur. Obviously, put it closer to exploitation, and that would trouble me, but also I understand that that's part of operations, and if they're proving as a veteran, I'm satisfied with that.
So just to wrap up, in your assessment of your position in overseeing cybersecurity and understanding that what the definition of secure is, what do you identify, especially in light of the reports that we have and the recommendation, what's your assessment of what a win will be in terms of what is success in cybersecurity?
So if are you asking the
Overall, in general, you've received recommendations from OIG and GAO, recognized many deficiencies, and so it seems like you're making progress. So what's success to you is my question.
Certainly. Thank you for clarification. I look at it that if we can look at the measures and metrics of how proactive we are in blocking, how proactive we are in identifying potential risks and then funding them, and then looking at over time what actually does occur to see if we predicted correctly. Certainly, we cannot gold plate every system to the degree that I would be comfortable saying that we're 100% sure that it won't occur. But how can we make sure that we show due diligence in identifying those? And that comes into the postmortem on how resilient we are, and then identifying when we do have a breach, what were the causal factors, and were those things tied to what we already knew? And if we knew that, why didn't we take that as a priority?
Okay, thank you. My time is up, and I am going to, I think we're ready to adjourn, so I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for your participation today. You know, as it comes to the VA providing care for our veterans, our men and women, especially with respect to data privacy, and this is the most sensitive personal data, and more importantly, it's a trust relationship in making sure that we are doing all we can to honor that trust that our veterans give to us, especially with respect to this data. So this is as we do the electronic health record modernization in dealing with the legacy systems that present some serious challenges with that aging technology, as well as the standards that you have in place and making sure the protocol is being followed. Certainly is a challenge, and I thank you for being here and for your effort and to address this, as well as OIG and GAO to keep us informed, and hopefully we can continue to work together in a cooperative spirit to make sure that we're protecting the data of our veterans, not just internally, but also as we discussed today with respect to applications as they become more and more widespread and used by our veterans. So thank you. This is hopefully the beginning of a back and forth conversation, and we'll continue to work together, especially as we provide the oversight in the modernization efforts. So all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material, and this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.